Obama has just commuted the sentences of 61 drug offenders. And he spent a lot of time lately focusing on the issue of criminal justice. Now, it all started when he became the first sitting president to visit a federal prison. He did that last year. He highlighted how America has the highest incarceration rate in the world, and he wants to turn things around. Well, that is the subject of a new book called Incarceration Nation. I spoke with its author, Peter Enns. There's a lot to get to, including the history of how we got to where we are today. But in terms of just from a macro standpoint, give an idea to an audience where the United States stands in comparison to the rest of the world in terms of the number of people it has behind bars.
Sure. The United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world. So we're the most prolific imprisoner of all countries.
And that's for everything, not just men, women, violent, nonviolent crimes across the board. We've got record people behind bars, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And that includes the types of imprisonment. So if you think of life without parole, we have the most with life without parole in prison. Another important consideration is if the U.S. has the highest incarceration rate, about a third of the states have incarceration rates that are higher than the United States average.
And to that end, one of the things I was surprised about that I didn't know before I looked at the book was how we got from there to here. And for people who assume that it was some hard right conservative president who really started the trend, in many ways you point to 64, where the campaign and the rhetoric with LBJ, a lot different than what happened when he got in office. And, you know, you saw it on the heels even of JFK before him and other Democrats that followed suit. This isn't a one-party problem, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Rich. And I mean, a couple things to remember. The U.S. hasn't always had the highest incarceration rate in the world. This has been a process over decades, and 64 was especially important because Johnson won by a landslide, and his rhetoric shifted following the election, despite his high approval ratings, and he was following increases in the public's punitiveness. He was reacting to the public.
And you don't lay it just at the feet of politicians. You also take a look at my world, the media, and I know you did some extensive looking at articles over a long number of years in terms of not only how it covered crime, but also sensationalized it.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that's very notable is when the crime rate shifts, the media does a pretty accurate job of covering more crime. When crime goes down, media covers less crime, but there's pretty systematic patterns of media coverage, right? So overemphasizing violent crime, and really focusing on the types of crime. And so how media covers crime is really important to this process.
So you got a lot of people at home, let's just be honest, Peter, who says, you know what, kind of cry me a river. Bad guy, bad woman, they do something, put him behind bars here. At the end of the day, we're safer as a public. Talk about some of the costs, both in terms of dollars and in terms of a cycle here that's happened just because of, as you say, the incarceration nation aspect and the industrialization that it's become, just how huge a population we're talking about. And also, I guess you can factor into that the rate of recidivism as a consequence.
Well, first, there's over 2 million people currently in prison and jails throughout the United States. That's a tremendously high amount, and that's not evenly distributed. So those of lower social class, racial minorities more likely to be in prison. But there's a cost to the overall economy. It costs a tremendous amount of money to maintain the world's highest incarceration rate. So in terms of the economic effects, everybody's affected. Now those in prison, in jail, they're affected, but there's effects to their communities, to their families. Over 2.7 million children have a parent incarcerated. And so the effects go well beyond just those who are in prison.
You know, I'll speak for myself. I know it's a subject you know very well. I haven't been involved in it directly, but one of the programs around here, Hudson Link, it educates inmates behind bars, and they have a near perfect rate of non-recidivism when these guys get out. It seems that there's a changing perception, and a very tangible one, Peter, in terms of how people feel about the subject. And I can even speak to New York. We've seen Governor Cuomo even twist quite a bit on this subject to the point right now where he's come out in favor of educating inmates. We've seen on the national level trying to decriminalize certain crimes here, go for treatment for drug abuse, for example, much more than automatic imprisonment or adoption of 3 strikes, etc. Talk about how the cultural shift has worked and attribute the reasons why people seem more open now to alternatives other than just locking them up and throwing away the key.
Yeah, that's a really important point because there's definitely a shift going on, as you point out, Rich, and even bipartisan calls for criminal justice reform. We're seeing more support for education programs in prisons. We're seeing more support for treatment-oriented policies as opposed to simply locking people up for a drug offense. And these are really important shifts. But of course, given how punitive the policies have become in the United States, shifts in a less punitive direction, we're still overall quite a punitive criminal justice system.
All right, Peter, for somebody on the fence right now to say, all right, I hear you. These guys are going to get out by and large sooner or later. We don't want them coming out worse than they went in, but at the same end, I don't want to make it less safe in my neighborhood as much as I'd like to save some money, which everybody acknowledges costs less money to figure out treating these guys rather than just throwing them away if it's related to drugs, for example. If they're on the fence, push them one way or the other. What's the smarter policy for us to do as a country?
Recidivism is a major issue. So if the conditions inside prisons can offer some support, educational opportunities, even safer conditions within the prison system, and then those released are less likely to commit a crime. It's a more cost-effective approach, and it's leading to less crime by reducing recidivism. The overwhelming majority of those currently in the U.S. prison system will at some point be released. So that's a very important perspective and fact to keep in mind.
Well, it's a fascinating read. Again, it's called Incarceration Nation. Peter Enns, thanks so much for the time. I appreciate it.
Hey, thank you. My pleasure.
We have some local headlines straight ahead. Stay with us.